yeah, this is the point in our program when we have invited a museum collection, or rather a curator from a museum collection, to talk to us a little bit about what they have. And it always piques our interest. We find new places we might want to go and do some research. So tonight we've got Joe Lance with us from the Worthing Museum, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the amazing fancy dress collection that they have there. So go ahead, Joe.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to attempt to share my screen. We practiced this earlier and it worked, so come on. Here we go. Can you see that? Does that look okay? All
Perfect.
Good? That's lovely. Thank you. I'm going to share with you today one of my favourite pieces from the wonderful collection at Worthing Museum and Art Gallery, which is a collection I know very well from my own PhD research. And it is a wonderful dress, and it's slightly creepy, which I'm hoping will be appropriate for us today, because it is a Victorian fancy dress adorned with beetle wings as part of the embroidery. And one of the things that I've always found really intriguing about this dress is that when the dress came into the collection in 1955, the original owner, maker or wearer was not identified. So we know very little about the provenance of this dress. And that is the case with a great many of the pieces in Worthing collection, particularly the ones which are homemade. We have lots of things and we don't necessarily know the backstory of them. So what follows is my attempt to place this dress into some sort of context through my own investigations. And briefly, the dress, we know that it's dated to the 1890s. From the construction of the bodice, which has the really full sleeves that were very fashionable in the mid 1890s, and from the way that the bodice is boned and pointed at the front. And it has this skirt, which is made from a cream cottonette, and it's embroidered with metallic threads, threaded with iridescent green wing cases of the jewel beetle. There's a slightly closer detail there, so hopefully you can get some idea of how intricate the embroidery is. And we think it was a fancy dress. And the reasons for believing this is that the silhouette of the dress, although we know it's from the 1890s, it doesn't conform to the perfect silhouette, which would have been fashionable in that period, because the skirt is very full. It's not smooth over the hips and flowing outwards at the bottom, which would have been more likely for fashionable dress. And also because of the way it's constructed. I'm a maker myself, and I'm really interested in how dresses are put together. And this one is very crudely sewn on the inside. And it very much looks as if the skirt has been removed from an earlier piece and then tacked on to a later bodice to create a fancy dress. Which suggests that the fabric of the skirt was considered quite valuable and preserved and then reused, which is something that is really interesting. The embroidery itself is really beautiful, and the arrangements of the beetle wings, which work like sequins or spangles and really catch the light, they give the dress a very ethereal fairy tale quality, which supports the argument that it was likely to be a fancy dress. And the pieces of beetle wing have been pierced and then sewn, so they are used effectively like natural sequins. And the metallic embroidery flows around the skirt and leads your eye around. It's a really beautiful thing. And also I think the fact that the beetle wings are so fragile, which would have limited the use of the textile, adds to this sort of sense of extravagance and decadence of the piece, which is also really interesting. And we know that the use of beetle wings for embroidery has a long history. It goes back to the Indian Mughal courts of the 17th and 18th century, where they were worn as signifiers of rank. And the beetle wings cases were collected in Burma and sold through markets in Calcutta. And they were valued for their hardness, their iridescence, and the permanence of the colour, which is actually not a pigment at all. It's formed by the way that the beetle wing actually refracts the light for evolutionary reasons. And they were originally believed to ward off evil spirits. And then later, the embroideries became very popular with Western women in India and Europe during the 19th century colonial period. And we know that embroideries with beetle wing decoration were initially made in India for export. The V&A has lots of export samples, for example, in their collection, which supports that. But they were so popular here in Europe that English embroiderers started importing beetle wings to imitate the embroidery domestically here as well. So you can see the spread of the idea and how popular it was. And something that struck me about the dress was how this Victorian taste for the exotic, for interesting gem-like things from around the empire, intersects with a heightened interest in natural history, which is occurring in the late Victorian period, and people like Charles Darwin and his contemporaries, their ideas about collecting and preserving the natural world and how it can be collected and conquered in a way. That's something that really interests me. And the beetle in particular captivated eminent natural historians, but also amateur collectors. They were really widely collected, and they were particularly favoured because of their profusion and diversity. There are literally millions of types of beetles out there, so it's almost like an endless collection. You can never collect them all. And we know that Darwin was an avid collector of beetles as he was a child, and that inspired his career later. So I'm really interested in that kind of Victorian enthusiasm for beetles and how they pop up periodically in popular culture, and also in the way that the animal kingdom was captured and exploited for fashionable purposes and scientific purposes, and how it's all connected. If we move forward a slide, in terms of insects and fancy dress, as is very well documented, by the 1890s, fancy dress balls and pageants were really popular in Western Europe and America, and there's some wonderful books on this. And while researching this, I looked at Arden Holt's What to Wear at Fancy Balls, which is a very popular guide to coming up with ideas for fancy dress parties. And it went through 6 editions from 1879 to 1896. And each time, each edition expands on the last, and by the latter issues, there are colour plates. And this is one of them here, and that's a hornet from 1896. And the contemporary fascination with etymology is reflected in this series. And I think it's really interesting because insects have their own life cycle, which often involves a dramatic metamorphosis, and that parallels the theme of the transformation, which is at the heart of a successful fancy dress costume. And in the 1887 edition, there are suggestions for a bee, a hornet, a dragonfly, a butterfly, and a beetle. And the description of the beetle is a dress of green tulle or green and gold tissue trimmed with iridescent beads. And I think that really encapsulates the dress at Worthing perfectly. And it suggests that you might like to wear it with a pointed velvet cap or a couple of toy beetles in your hair. And I really wish that there were hair ornaments that had survived with the dress, but alas, that is not the case. But I think it's really fun to visualize those things in place. Ooh. So to our modern eyes, the idea of wearing insect carapaces on clothing seems rather macabre. But during this period, there was a real passion for using parts of dead animals as ornaments, both in the home and on the bodily person. And the more exotic, the better. Iridescent materials such as beetle wings and the plumage of the hummingbird or the peacock were particularly prized. And whole taxidermied birds were used on hats, for example. So it's so far removed from modern sensibilities that it makes this sort of garment particularly fascinating and intriguing to us today, I think. And in my reading on the Victorian grotesque, I was looking at Sheila Wilson, and she talks about how the definition of the grotesque goes beyond the simply monstrous or perverse and involves a specific relationship between the object and the physical connection with the body. And I think that really resonates here, because she observes that there's a disquieting disruption in the idea that an ornament, such as the beetle wing, which is intended to feminize the feminine and the beautiful, result in a body being covered in dead insects. So I suppose really it's the tension between the beauty and the revulsion, which is at the heart of this sort of garment, which I find most interesting. And although when they were beautifully arranged and skillfully embroidered onto the textile as though they were gems or sequins, they were abstracted from their original form, but everybody would have known what they were. In the Victorian period, insect jewellery was very popular, and other beetle wing embroidery dresses from this period survive in the museum collections. The V&A has one that they showed in 2018 as part of Fashion from Nature. And on the left here, there's an image of the costume that Ellen Terry famously wore when she was Lady Macbeth in 1888. And it's a dress that's crocheted and absolutely encrusted with thousands and thousands of beetle wings. And it has this magnificent, almost snake-like quality to it. It looks like it's entirely covered in scales, and it's very strange and it's very dark and completely appropriate for Lady Macbeth. So I suppose really, I just wanted to share with you this fabulous example and to think a little bit about what can we glean from garments when they are anonymous and we don't know very much about the reasons for their being. And I suppose really the fact that it's a composite garment, and the likelihood is that the skirt was from an earlier piece and then refashioned as fancy dress at the end of the 19th century when the vogue for costume balls was reaching its peak. I love the way how it is indicative of the sort of improvised nature of fancy dress, which is something I'm really interested in amateur sewing, and how often you use what you have, or you use pre-existing things in inventive and interesting ways. So that's something that I think is really striking about this piece. And I mean, fancy dress was very ephemeral, and it's diversion and it's spectacle and it's fun, but the themes that were selected for the costumes truly reflect the cultural preoccupations of the time. And I think this dress really encapsulates the Victorian taste for the exotic, for things from the empire, and how that intersects with the fascination with the natural world and the ways in which it can be used and exploited and captured. And also how the visual culture of this period associated women with nature in particular, and the idea of metamorphosis. These are recurring themes that you see in the visual culture of the 1900s, like particularly Art Nouveau, where there's those magnificent winged creatures and winged ladies and that sort of thing. So I think it's all connected. And yeah, thank you so much for allowing me to share this wonderful museum object with you. If anyone has any questions, I can endeavour to answer them. Thank you very much.
Jo, thank you very much for sharing that with us. And I know you've got a lot of really incredible items. Oh, what's this?
Oh, this is my bonus slide. I nearly forgot. This is just one example of how the Victorian fascination for beetles pops up here and there in popular culture. And this is a creepy horror novel from 1897, which is called The Beetle. And the villain I'm sorry if this is a terrible spoiler, but the villain in the book is actually an Egyptian scarab beetle that is a murderer and has occult powers. And it's just so Halloween and so fabulous. I had to add it in at the end.
Thank you. It is really fabulous.
Yeah.
It's really great.
There we go.
And also thank you for the reference on that How to Fancy Dress book. That costume was amazing, and I think we all need that book to start planning our Halloween parties. Definitely. We have a couple minutes for questions. We're a little short on time, but if anyone's got any questions for Jo, Lynn, do you?
No, there's just not any questions per se that I can see. Though interesting, Anna said that she was at a party yesterday, children's party, and there were several children dressed up as caterpillars and bees. It's still very popular.
Perennial favourites.
Yeah, and I mean, as an embroiderer, we regularly buy beetle wings.
Interesting.
So our students are still very much stitching with them because they're just so exotic. I mean, it's like using peacock feathers as well. So because of their iridescent quality, they're just great. Oh, there's a raised hand from Veronica, and I was going to actually defer to Veronica given her knowledge on this.
No, I promise I'm not going to talk about Ellen Terry. You are safe. I was actually just going to say, given that we have the museum 5 minutes to sort of share collections, and you've shown just one of the many treasures that I know are in Worthing, it would be quite nice to maybe touch on how people can learn more about the collection and if it's accessible for appointments, that sort of thing.
Oh, sure. Yes, I didn't want to go too much into it because I was aware that I only had a few minutes to talk, but that one costume is one of several 19th century fancy dress costumes that are at Worthing. So if anyone is interested in that area, but the collection as a whole, it's absolutely magnificent. It's over 30,000 pieces, and it's particularly strong on 19th century dress and also handmade and amateur pieces and accessories, and they are open for research appointments. You just need to contact Jerry Connolly, who's the curator manager, and his email is online. If you just Google Worthing Museum, you'll find the contact there. And often I assist with research appointments. Often it's me who goes into the costume store and digs out the boxes. So it would be lovely to meet anybody if they want to come and have a look at the pieces there. Do send him inquiries. It's a really friendly and welcoming museum.
I can attest to that because Jo has actually helped me to look at a piece of 19th century fancy dress and introduced me to those very costume books that she showed there, which include tips on how to dress like Ellen Terry in her Shakespearean roles. So yes, it's a wonderful collection, and Jo is great to work with as well.
Did people imitate that dress? Like, did people imitate the Lady Macbeth dress?
They did at the time and since.
That's wonderful.
But you don't want another paper from me, or you'll get a whole list.
Yes, please.
Less for fancy dress, more for stage dress.
Okay.
I think because it was quite a lot to take on.
Yes, that would be an ambitious costume for a fancy dress party to replicate. I can imagine. I mean, I like to make costumes myself, but that's a commitment, definitely.
One of these days we need to get Zenzi in here for a talk. Yeah. Actually, let's put that on the agenda. Zenzi Tinker, for those who don't know, is the person
I think I could twist her arm. I think I could twist her arm.
Yes, Veronica, put that on your to-do list. To do. Yeah, to do.